The young girl sat quietly in her wheelchair by the window, where the soft morning light filtered through the glass, turning her honey-brown hair into gold. Her legs rested under a thin blanket, unmoving. On her lap lay an open book, a well-worn copy of a Jane Austen classic. Beside her, a cup of cocoa had long gone cold, though its sweet aroma lingered in the air. From outside, the familiar rhythm of her grandfather chopping wood reached her ears, steady and slow like a heartbeat. It made her feel safe. Ellie raised a hand to block the light, squinting at the cloudy sky. The sun was still hidden behind veils of pale gray, but slowly, it was making its way through. A new day was coming. Then came the sound of a door opening down the hallway. "You're up?" Thomas's voice, low and gravelly, carried in gently. He pushed the door open with a tray in his hands, oatmeal, a sliced apple, and toast. "Did you stay up reading again, or just forget the timer?" His smile was soft. Ellie shook her head with a small sigh. "I just didn't want to get up yet. It's such a nice morning." Thomas set the tray on the bedside table, gently adjusting the blanket over her shoulders. Though they had lived together for nearly 2 years, he still moved around her with a kind of reverence. Quiet, careful, never wanting to cause harm, not even where no wounds were visible. As Ellie began to eat, Thomas busied himself quietly mopping the floor. His movements were precise, always steering clear of cords, slick patches, or anything that could pose a risk. He had modified the house in countless little ways. Widened hallways, rails in the bathroom, lowered windows so Ellie could always see outside. But what he couldn't fix was the silence that fell every afternoon. After breakfast, Ellie would sit on the porch, her lap covered in wool. Thomas would sit nearby, his hand resting on the old dog lying between them. They didn't speak. Only the wind rustled through the orchard, the tin roof creaked, and now and then, a distant train whistle would echo across the land. The view was so still, so quiet, it hurt. As though the world was waiting for a storm, a knock, a shift. Ellie let out a soft sigh. "Dad, do you miss her?" Thomas didn't answer immediately. After a long pause, he gave a single nod. "Every day. Every time the wind comes through the window, I think she'll call me." They stayed quiet, not from lack of words, but because the truth behind the words was too hard to voice. When the sun finally emerged, Ellie returned inside for physical therapy. As Thomas wheeled her down the hallway, the look in his eyes was no longer that of a retired soldier. It was that of a father trying to hold together the pieces of a world that had cracked open. At noon, the breeze shifted. It carried the scent of wet soil and decaying leaves. Ellie sat in the living room, light streaming across her hands, which gripped the wheelchair's arms. After 15 minutes of exercises, her forehead beaded with sweat despite the cold. Thomas placed a glass of water on the table and sat silently across from her. He didn't push her to continue, didn't offer sympathy, just stayed. Sometimes knowing someone is there is enough. Ellie looked up, her eyes calm and still like a late autumn lake. "Do you think, if the road hadn't been wet that day, if the truck hadn't run that light, would things be different?" She didn't need an answer. Thomas stared out the window, rubbing his palm absently, a habit from his days in uniform. "You're not to blame, Ellie," he said slowly. "Neither are your parents. Some things just happen, like storms." Ellie let out a quiet laugh, not because it was funny, but because she'd heard that answer over and over. And yet, the ache inside hadn't dulled. The scar that ran from her hip to her heel still pulsed in quiet moments. It happened that June afternoon. They had been driving back from a short trip. Ellie in the back seat, headphones in, sun warming her face. Then came the red light. Then the crash. Metal twisting, glass breaking. Her mother's scream. She awoke in the hospital, staring at a ceiling bathed in sterile white. No feeling in her legs. First a nurse, then Thomas. His eyes red, hand gripping hers. They told her she wouldn't walk again, and that her parents hadn't survived. Ellie didn't cry, didn't scream. She turned to stone. Weeks passed. No words, no therapy, no mirrors. It was Thomas who brought her back. Not with speeches, but with consistency. Stories from his youth, from his time in the war, from her aunt's laughter. He carried her when she couldn't move, taught her to hold a spoon again, to brush her hair, to face the sunrise, even with just a hint of a smile. 2 years passed. The pain never left. It only went quiet, like something waiting. But Ellie learned to live again. Slowly. She could shift in bed without knocking over her pillow, turn on the heater alone. She looked at her grandfather watching birds drift across the sky. "Thank you, Grandpa, for not giving up on me." Thomas turned. His expression softened like the evening sun. "You're all I've got, Ellie. I wouldn't know what else to do." Outside, the air smelled like change, like the edge of a new season. But they didn't yet know that a shadow had begun to move toward them. Later that afternoon, while Thomas was fixing the southern fence, the distant hum of an engine reached his ears. He stood, brow furrowed. A silver pickup crept along the dirt road and stopped at the gate. A tall man stepped out, late 40s, tan skin, leather jacket, and a half smile that seemed to wait for someone to make a mistake. "Hey there," the man called, waving. "Name's Rick. Just moved in over the hill." Thomas approached slowly, hammer still in hand. His face wasn't unfriendly, but far from relaxed. "I know that house," he said flatly. "Didn't think anyone lived there anymore." Rick stepped closer, offering a handshake. Thomas didn't take it. "Yeah, been fixing it up. Saw you working, figured I'd say hello. Guess that's neighborly, right?" Thomas studied him. Something in the man's ease felt off. Too easy. Not wrong exactly, but not right. Ellie, from her window, heard the voice. She wheeled herself closer, parting the curtains. Rick was gesturing at his truck, laughing. Moments later, Thomas came into the kitchen muttering, "New guy's name is Rick. Lives west." "What do you think?" Ellie asked, filling a glass of water. "Mouth runs too much. Eyes won't sit still." She didn't understand, but she knew Thomas didn't trust easily. The next day, Rick returned, with apples and a box of cookies. "Baked 'em myself," he grinned. "Thought the little lady might enjoy some." Thomas didn't move from the doorway, his frame solid as a wall. Hearing voices, Ellie came to the entrance in her chair. She smiled politely. "Thank you, Rick." His gaze flicked briefly from her face to her wheelchair. It lasted only a second, but it was enough to give her a chill. As if something in him liked what he saw. "She's adorable," he said evenly. "Bet it gets boring around here, huh?" Thomas cleared his throat. Rick stepped back. "Just being friendly. If you need anything, tools, tractor, whatever, just say the word." He turned and drove off, dust rising behind the truck. Thomas stood still for a long time, watching. After that, Rick came by more often, sometimes with firewood, sometimes borrowing tools, sometimes just talking. Always pleasant, always polite, always just enough. But Thomas never smiled. Ellie, who had kept her distance at first, found herself replying more. Her world was small, and sometimes a new presence softened the edges of loneliness. Still, she didn't trust him completely. There were little moments, too small to prove, too strange to ignore. The way Rick watched her hands on the wheels. The way he asked, "Do you stay alone a lot?" Once, while helping Mr. Thomas with a bag of rice, Rick accidentally let his hand touch Ellie's shoulder. Longer than necessary, she flinched back, but he just laughed and said, "It was an accident, that." Feeling the sudden chill that ran down her spine stayed with her. All that afternoon that night, after cleaning the kitchen, Thomas turned off the lights earlier than usual. He stood by the living room window, looking out into the darkness. The wind howled through the cracks in the wood. The forest beyond was pitch black. He squeezed the gun hanging on the wall, not because he was afraid, but because he knew there were predators that didn't growl or bar their fangs. They waited. They were patient, and they smiled softly. October passed with colder winds and foggy mornings that lasted until noon. The leaves in the Thomas backyard began to fall, and the smell of dead grass and damp earth permeated the wood. The sweaters, the breaths of old and young. But it wasn't just the weather that had changed. The atmosphere in the cabin had changed too, as heavy and gloomy as the name Rick was being mentioned. More and more Rick came by more often, always with a reason. Sometimes he'd bring some homemade apple pie. Sometimes he'd stop by to fix the hinges on the back gate because they felt a little loose. Other days he'd just stand by the fence, nod, smile, and say, "It's a nice day." And every time he lingered long enough for his eyes to wander over the house. Especially Ellie, his gaze was no longer polite or curious, but secretly appraising, as if she were no longer a person, but an object he was weighing. One morning, Thomas went out into the garden early. When he returned, he found Rick sitting on the steps talking to Ellie. "Your grandfather is really good." Rick laughed, his voice strangely friendly. "He does everything by himself, but he's old, don't you think?" Ellie smiled politely, but her eyes couldn't hide her surprise. She replied softly, "Your grandfather is still very strong. I think he can handle it." Rick tilted his head, squinted his eyes, narrowed slightly. Not from the sun, but from holding back something. Then he smiled as if he had never said anything noteworthy. Thomas stood behind the door for a few seconds, then opened it with a loud bang. "Do you need something?" Rick turned back, his hands raised as if he had been caught doing something wrong. "Nothing, Mr. Thomas. I was just talking for a bit." Thomas said nothing, just looked. Rick understood, stood up, brushed his hands on his jeans, and turned away with a smile on his face. But before he left the wooden steps, he glanced back slowly, tentatively. That afternoon, as the two of them sat on the porch drinking hot tea, Thomas asked, "How do you feel about Rick?" Ellie was silent for a moment. "It's a little weird. I can't say it, but he makes me feel uncomfortable, Grandpa." "Like the way he looks at me. I don't like the way he looks at me." Thomas nodded slightly. He had always trusted his instincts and Ellie's. But hearing her say that he felt even more that something was quietly cracking beneath the peaceful facade, a few days later, Rick returned, this time when Thomas was not home. He went to town to get medicine, telling Ellie to stay inside and lock the door carefully. Rick came standing in front of the front door, holding a box of cookies. "Honey, can you open the door for a moment? I brought you some cookies." Ellie sat inside, looking through the curtains, her hands paused on the wheels of her wheelchair. "Thank you, but I can't do it today. Grandpa isn't home." Her voice was polite, clear, but Rick didn't leave right away. He stood there, bent over the door, his voice low. "Don't you trust me? Just open it for a moment. I won't come in." "I just want to talk." Ellie didn't reply. Her hand reached for her phone, turned on the screen. No signal outside the door. Rick stood for a few seconds, then turned away. But he didn't leave completely. Ellie saw him go around to the back of the garden where there was a small path leading to the shed. She locked the back door, pushed the wheelchair to the table where there was a small fruit knife. Ellie's eyes were no longer frightened, but alert. For the first time since the accident, she felt the need to do something, not to hide, but to defend herself. That evening Thomas returned. Ellie told him everything. He didn't say a word. He just walked into the shed, checked the shotgun, cleaned the barrel, and put it back on the wooden hook next to the front door. His hands were shaking slightly, but his eyes were brighter than ever, as if some old instinct had been awakened. That night he slept in the armchair in the living room. The old dagger was in his coat pocket, and his eyes like those of an old owl. Never left the darkness outside the window. The weather was changeable. In early November, the mornings were foggy, so thick that one could barely see more than a few feet, and the afternoons were a steady, steady rain. Like a long sigh from the earth, the farm was a gray ash, and the steady patter of water droplets falling from the old tin roof onto the muddy ground. Thomas did not like this season. It reminded him of his days in the jungle. The rain never stopped the mud up to his knees, and the feeling of being watched from among the bushes that never went away. Now he felt the same. It all started with a blackout one night, around 3:00 in the morning. There was a short click, and all the lights in the house went out. Thomas sat bolt upright in his chair. He was used to being jolted out of sleep. His eyes immediately went to the gun hanging by the door. The wind howled through the crack in the window. A side door at the back of the house rattled, though he was sure he'd locked it. He picked up his flashlight and walked slowly down the hall. When he reached the back door, he stopped. The light showed muddy boot prints on the wooden floor. The mud was still wet, not his, not Ellie's. He released the safety on his gun, but when he opened the door, there was nothing but darkness and the smell of dirt, only wind, and the feeling that something had escaped before he'd seen it. He didn't tell Ellie the next morning she was still sleeping. Her small hands neatly placed on the covers, her breathing even. She'd had enough. Instead, he went into town. No reason given when he returned. His van was packed with supplies, barbed wire, new locks, motion sensor lights, a pack of shotgun shells, and the one he was most careful about, a handheld siren, the kind used by disabled people in emergencies. Ellie watched him unload the items without asking. Her eyes began to change, no longer with simple surprise or concern, but with the intuition of someone who had faced the fear of death. "It's him again, isn't it?" she asked, her voice low. Thomas paused, then nodded. He didn't just knock on the door this time. 3 days later, just as dusk was falling, Ellie was sitting by the window when she saw something flicker on the edge of the woods far away. At the end of the garden, she squinted a shadow. Not sure, but for a moment, she felt like she was being watched. A chill ran down her spine. She closed the curtains and pushed the wheelchair toward the living room. Thomas was cleaning his gun, moving slowly, almost ritualistically. He didn't look at her, just asked, "Is there something else? There's someone out in the woods. It could be Rick." Thomas paused. He stood up, took his binoculars from the drawer, and went out onto the porch. The wind was stronger than in the afternoon, carrying the scent of wet leaves and dead grass. He watched in silence. Nothing but... It was the absence that made him more alert. Rick wasn't stupid. He knew how to hide. He knew when to advance, when to retreat. He put his hand on Ellie's shoulder. "You'll never have to face him alone." Thomas didn't sleep that night. He walked around the house 3 times, checked every lock, every window, turned on all the motion sensor lights in the backyard, his old dog. Once, a police dog was slow now, but he still lay on the porch, bristles bristling whenever the wind changed direction. Around 2 o'clock, in the morning, the sensor light behind the house came on. Thomas rushed out, gun raised. There was no sound, no footprints. But the sensor light wasn't broken. It only came on when there was actual movement. He walked down the backyard. Gun pointed down, but his arms tensed. He stopped on the fence post. Someone had deliberately hung a dry branch bent into a shape that looked almost like a snake. It was a sick game, like a mark of territory. A message, "I was here." Thomas took it down and threw it into the fire. His heart went cold, not because of the wind, but because he knew Rick had started treating this place like a hunting ground. The next morning, he gave Ellie a new siren. Just press this button and the siren will sound loud enough to call you. Even if you're in the garden?" Ellie took it, her hand shaking, but she didn't ask. "What if you can't hear me?" She just nodded. Thomas looked at his niece for a long time. "This time, if he comes back, I won't just scare him." The sky turned leading. More leaves fell, blocking the familiar paths around the farm. Ellie sat in her room, her eyes glued to the curtains as if she could see through them. In her hand the siren lay, like a small but resilient hope. And in the darkness, Rick waited. Not in a hurry, not in a hurry. A true predator knows exactly when to strike. The morning sky was ashen gray. A light drizzle falling steadily on the tin roof. The wind blew through the cracks in the door, making a whistling sound like someone's breathing. Lurking behind the forest, Thomas was wearing a raincoat, holding a cloth bag containing prescriptions and a medical book. "I'll be back before noon. Just go to town to get the medicine, then go straight home." "You'll be fine," Ellie replied as gently as ever. The door's locked, the siren's been tested, the phone's fully charged. Thomas nodded his eyes, lingered for a few seconds on the siren in Ellie's palm, as if giving her one last warning. He bent down, placed his hand on her knee, and lowered his voice. "If anything, you blow the siren. Even if it's just a bad feeling, do you understand?" Ellie pursed her lips and nodded. Mr. Thomas's pickup truck gradually disappeared down the muddy dirt road. The sound of the engine faded away, leaving a lonely silence between the patter of rain and the wind blowing across the fields like an ill-timed lullaby. Ellie pushed the cart toward the living room. Checking the door and latch, she wasn't afraid, just wary as he had told her. Glancing out the window, she saw only opaque mist, the rain-soaked treetops drooping as if whispering to each other. She made a cup of cocoa, opened the book she was reading. The sound of the rain mixed with the wind made the house drift into a slow, lulling rhythm. Then a knock on the door 3 times, not loud, not hurried, just loud enough to be heard, and to make everyone in the house skip a beat. Ellie paused. It couldn't be him. It hadn't been 15 minutes. She quietly pushed the cart closer to the door, not saying a word through the gap in the curtains. She saw a familiar baseball cap and dark brown hair soaked with water. Rick, he was standing on the porch, holding something wrapped in brown paper cookies. Or coffee, perhaps, as he had done before. But this time, he wasn't smiling. Rick's face was almost expressionless, his eyes fixed on the door as if he knew he was being watched from inside Ellie. He said not loudly, but clearly through the door, "I brought you apple pie. It's still warm." She didn't answer. Her hand touched the alarm on her wrist, not yet pressed. Rick continued, "Your grandfather isn't home, is he?" This time she heard something in his voice. It wasn't the forced friendliness she'd felt before, but something dry, naked, like the truth didn't need to be covered up. She backed away, her hands shaking slightly, mentally reciting her response, pushing the chair back, going around to the hallway, locking the kitchen door behind her, calling for him, taking the knife from the drawer outside. Rick stopped knocking. He started turning the doorknob. The doorknob turned slowly. Click, Ellie stiffened. The soft squeak of the wooden hinges was enough to announce that someone was entering. No knocking, no asking permission, no excuses. Just the sound of wet boots on the wood. Rick was in the house, Ellie. He called, his voice strangely low. "Are you okay?" "The door's wide open. I was worried." She didn't answer, didn't move. Her eyes were glued to the hallway beyond the front door where Rick's shadows stretched across the wet wood floor. He took his time, step by step, like someone strolling through his own garden. Ellie backed up. Her heart was pounding as if it wanted to escape her chest. Her right hand tightened on the siren, but a part of her mind held back. What if he snatched it from her? What if he didn't hear it? He stepped into the living room, stopping less than 10 feet from her. Rick's eyes locked on hers. There was no mask. It was the gaze of a hunter. Cold, brazen, calculating. "You're all alone," he said, his eyes scanning the house. "Quiet, beautiful." He placed the bag of apple pie on the table. But he didn't take his eyes off Ellie. Then he knelt down slowly to her level, as if to close the distance. "You know," Rick whispered, his voice smooth as honey, but thick with decay, "I've never seen anyone like you. Even in a wheelchair, you're beautiful." Ellie shivered. She backed up, but hit the corner of the table. The wheels caught on the carpet, preventing her from moving any further. Rick stepped forward, still low like a reptilian wolf. He reached out, touching the side of the wheelchair. "Don't be afraid," he said. "I won't hurt you if you're good." At that, Ellie pressed the siren. The siren wailed shrill, echoing through the house, ripping through the air like a knife. Rick flinched, jerked his hand back, and stood up, his eyes flashing with anger. "You think that'll stop me?" Ellie reached for a nearby drawer where the fruit knife was hidden, but Rick saw he moved faster, yanking Ellie's hand back, causing the wheelchair to swerve to the side. She screamed, struggling. His grip on her wrist was so tight that the blood stopped and her fingertips turned pale. "Be quiet. Don't make things worse," Rick growled, his eyes bloodshot. The siren continued to blare, but he didn't care. He had gone too far beyond the limits of reason, and Ellie knew this was the moment. Rick tightened his grip on Ellie's wrist, his eyes dark as a storm rolling down the plains. She tried to pull away, struggling violently. But her body was too weak. Her legs couldn't support her. Couldn't kick, run, or turn without support. The sirens were still blaring. The shrill scream pierced her eardrums, but no one came. There were no neighbors nearby, no patrol cars. The farm was isolated. That's why Thomas had called it safe. But now that peace had turned into a death trap. Rick leaned closer, his hand leaving her wrist, only to grab her collar. Yanking her hard, the crew neck sweater was pulled askew, one shoulder sliding down, revealing a pale undershirt. The fabric stretched taut, the tiny tearing of threads ringing like lightning down Ellie's spine. "Don't fight," Rick said, his voice now completely revealed, no pretense, no cover. "I don't stand a chance. No one is coming." Ellie cried. Tears welled up in her eyes that she didn't have time to wipe away. But not from fear, but from anger, from disgust, from helplessness, because she had thought she was better, stronger. But now she was being pushed back into the same old feeling. The feeling of being a burden, a target, the hunted. Rick reached out to touch her cheek. His palm was wet, cold, and shaking. But not from fear, from excitement. Ellie tilted her head away, then suddenly bit hard on his wrist. Rick screamed. Jerking his hand away, blood seeped from the bite, dripping onto the carpet in that chaotic moment. Ellie pushed herself out of the wheelchair and onto the wooden floor. Her head hit the old carpet, her vision blurred, but she still tried to crawl on her hands towards the kitchen where the knife was still in the drawer. Under the stove, Rick roared like a wounded animal. He kicked the wheelchair hard, knocking it against the wall. He rushed after her, each step heavy. No more smiles, no more pretense. There was only one thing in his eyes, the determination to possess. "You think you can get away, bitch?" he screamed, the hiss tearing from his throat like a wild animal. Ellie tried to crawl towards the kitchen. Her hand scratched her clothes, disheveled her head, spinning only a few meters left just to get to the drawer. Rick bent down, grabbed the back of her shirt, and yanked her back at that moment in panic and pain. Ellie let out a piercing scream. Not out of fear, but because she knew that if no one came right now, it would all be over. And in that moment, amid the howling wind, the sirens fading as the batteries died amid the gasps and the smell of sweat, blood and damp earth, the front door swung open. Thomas stood there. His eyes were red. He held a loaded shotgun. Rick turned when he heard the door slam open. In that instant, the room froze. Thomas stood in the doorway, a thin figure in a saw and raincoat. One hand holding the shotgun aimed straight at Rick, the other gripping the stock until it was white. Rain ran down his silver hair, sticking to his forehead, his eyes burning, not the eyes of an old man, but of an old beast, driven to the limit. Rick blinked, taking an instinctive step back. His mouth opened as if to say something, but Thomas didn't give him the chance. "Let go of my granddaughter," He hissed, his voice like burning coals sweeping down his throat. Rick stood upright, his hand still holding Ellie's shoulder as she writhed on the floor. Blood from the bite on his hand was still dripping onto his shirt. He didn't speak, didn't defend himself. But in his eyes was the hatred, the bitterness, the madness of a man who had been stopped just before the last bite. "You wouldn't dare shoot?" Rick said softly, his voice calm to the point of being creepy. "You're a weak old man. Your gun is shaking. Your heart is racing. An old man who thinks he's still a soldier." Thomas took a step forward. The muzzle of the gun didn't waver. His hand, though shaking, still held the gun steady like a wooden stake in a storm. "I raised my nephew for the rest of my life. Do you think I'll let him lie under you without doing anything?" Rick laughed, dryly, madly. He took a step back, then suddenly pushed hard against the table, causing the glasses to shatter. As a distraction, he rushed back, trying to escape to the kitchen door. Bang! The sound of the gun exploded loudly like thunder, tearing through the sky. The smell of gunpowder dissipated immediately, mixing with the smell of rain and blood. Rick collapsed, his body slamming into the kitchen doorway. His left shoulder was bleeding, blood spurting down the wall like red ink. He groaned, each word grating like a beast whose vitals had been pierced. Thomas still didn't lower his gun. He stepped forward, each step heavy as if nailed to the wooden floor. The wind from the door blew his hair up, but his eyes never left Rick for a second. "You're alive, because I want you to live to pay." He kicked away the fruit knife Rick had almost grabbed as he crawled across the floor. Rick looked up, his face contorted with pain and panic, his eyes pleading, but there was still a fire in them. Something that hadn't gone out yet. Thomas bent down, checked Ellie's pulse. She was still conscious, her face covered in tears and sweat. Her whole body shaking, but her lips were pressed tightly together. When she saw him, she let out a sob as if the world had just been saved. He held her close, hastily, forcefully, as if afraid she would disappear. "He's here. He's here." The rest of the scene, Rick lying convulsing in a pool of blood, Thomas kneeling beside Ellie, and the sound of police sirens, small but clear, blaring in the distance, getting closer and closer. The police siren rang out like a bell of salvation, shining brightly in the drizzling rain. The red and blue lights flashed through the trees and windows, reflecting on the walls of the house. Patches of light that throbbed like the heartbeat of a person who had just escaped death. Rick was handcuffed, blood still seeping from his left shoulder. He groaned all the way to the stretcher, but no one said a word to him. In those wide eyes looking up at the gray sky, there was no longer the madness of a predator, but the defeat of an animal that had been defeated too quickly and too unexpectedly. A young policeman leaned over and asked Thomas, "Do you need a doctor to check you? Your hands are shaking?" Thomas shook his head, his eyes still fixed on Ellie, who was being helped onto a small stretcher by two nurses wrapped tightly in blankets. She said nothing, but her eyes were fixed on him for the first time since the accident. She looked at him with the eyes of a child in need of protection, and also the eyes of someone who understood what it meant to fight for survival. The afternoon passed slowly, as if the world were recovering. The rain had stopped. The wind had died down on the kitchen table. The broken glass had been gathered. Blood had been wiped away, but was still faintly smeared on the carpet like the indelible traces of a nightmare. Ellie was examined by a doctor, suffering only minor abrasions. Skin abrasions on her arms and knees. She refused to go to the hospital, wanting to stay home. Thomas said nothing. He understood at home. At least she felt she had a choice at the hospital. She was once again the weak one, the victim, the name on the report at night. The two of them sat together in the living room. The lights were just bright enough, the tea was hot. The wind from the porch gently beat against the glass doors. Thomas looked at her for a long time. He didn't know what to say in the war. He had faced death, the thin line between right and wrong. Life and death, but never before had the fear been so clear when the person in danger was not his comrades, but the only remaining member of his family. "You're strong. he said softly. Ellie looked up. Her eyes red but alert. I was scared, very scared. But then all I could think about was, "You'll come back." Thomas turned away, but his voice broke despite his efforts. "You shouldn't have left. You should know if you hadn't come in time, it would have happened." No one said the word. But they both understood, and it was precisely because they couldn't name it. That they understood how terrible it was before going to bed. Ellie sat in front of the mirror, brushing her hair. She saw herself, scratched shoulders, disheveled hair, and dark eyes. But she saw herself. No one could take that away from her. And Thomas stood by the window, looking out at the edge of the forest. The darkness was still thick. The trees still rustled, and the silence was as suspicious as every night. But now, in that darkness, he was no longer afraid. Not because he was getting older, but because he knew he could still protect the most important things when necessary. A man could still be a wall. However old, however cracked the next morning. As dawn filtered through the crack in the door, Ellie woke up. She turned herself to sit up, reached for a glass of water, and pushed the cart out onto the porch. The sky was clear. The sun was gentle. The old dog lay curled up asleep. The cart's wheels imprinted on the wooden floor, still wet from the night before. Thomas sat there, coffee in hand. His eyes on the fields. Ellie said nothing. She just sat next to him. And they both looked out into the distance where the sky was starting to turn blue again. 3 days after the incident, the sky was still dark, the wind was still blowing, but there were no more sirens, no more gunshots, no more heavy footsteps. Of the predator prowling around the cabin, everything had calmed down on the surface. At least Rick was arrested that same night, bleeding half his body but still alive. The doctor stitched up his wound at the town infirmary. Then the police transferred him to a neighboring county jail. He didn't resist, didn't say anything, just stared blankly through the window of the police car as if the world had drained his soul from him. Rick was said to have a criminal record in another state for harassment, for abuse. But he had managed to avoid it under a new identity. He rented the old farmhouse to live in isolation, like an old animal. But this time no one could save him from the truth, and this time he picked the wrong prey. Ellie sat in bed looking out the window as she always did. But this time her eyes weren't longing for the sun. She didn't need the sun. She didn't need the light. She just needed silence. The doctors said she wasn't badly hurt. Just scratches, a concussion, and a bruise on her wrist. But they couldn't get to the deeper parts, the parts that couldn't be MRI or bandaged, where the nightmares grew insidiously. Every night she woke up twice a night, her back drenched in sweat, her breathing uneven. Sometimes she screamed, sometimes she just hiccuped, not making a sound. Thomas was always there. He didn't say much, didn't ask, "Are you okay?" Because he knew nothing was. He just sat there, holding her hand, heavy and warm. When she woke, eyes wide with panic, he would touch her cheek and say in a voice that sounded like an oath, "You're safe." And she believed not because of his words, but because of his presence, as solid as a stone wall. No matter how strong the wind blew, it would not collapse on the 4th day. Ellie took the initiative to go to the kitchen. She still used a wheelchair. Moving slowly, but this time, no one had to remind her. She got her own cup, turned on the faucet, and made herself her first cup of cocoa since the incident. Thomas just stood there watching, not intervening. "Did you sleep better?" he asked. Ellie nodded slightly. Then she said, "For the first time since that day, I don't dream about him anymore. But I still hear him in my head." Thomas didn't answer right away. He pulled up a chair opposite, tapping his fingers lightly on the wooden table. "I'll hear it for a while. Then it will get quieter, but my voice will get louder." She looked at him, her eyes shining with something between tiredness and hope. "Am I very weak, Grandpa?" "No, weakness is knowing you're afraid and not admitting it. You survived. You're a fighter for the first time." Ellie smiled, a faint, weak smile. But true. She didn't smile because it was over. She smiled because she could smile. That for her now was a huge step that evening. Thomas hung the gun back up on the rack. He cleaned it thoroughly, oiled it, checked every part, and then placed it high up where he kept it as a reminder. I did what I had to do, but I hope I don't have to do it again. Ellie sat on the porch, a blanket draped over her lap, looking out at the distant patch of land where she'd first seen Rick. Now there was only a faded fence and a patch of grass that hadn't grown back. She blinked, but she didn't shudder. No more fear, no more disgust, just the very real silence of a survivor. She turned around and saw Mr. Thomas sitting behind her, sharpening his small knife. He didn't look at her, but his voice was loud enough for her to hear. You survived, Ellie. Now it's time for you to learn how to live. November passed quietly. No more gunshots, no more knocking on the porch door, just peaceful mornings, the smell of burnt toast, and the scratching of Ellie's pen on paper. As she wrote something in her notebook after the incident, she didn't go out much, but she didn't lock herself away either. Every morning she pushed her wheelchair to the window, breathed in the cold fresh air, and sat down to do regular leg stretches. Not because the doctor told her to, but because she wanted to do it for herself. One day, Thomas was busy repairing the roof of the chicken coop when he heard the rustling of his wheelchair coming out onto the porch. Ellie sat down next to him, holding a stack of papers neatly tucked in a plastic cover. Grandpa Thomas raised his head from under the roof, holding his hand to block the sun. Aren't you cold? No, I want to talk. Thomas climbed down the ladder, brushed his hands off his pants, and sat down next to her. Ellie handed him the papers. I'm back in school online starting next week. Thomas opened the papers, the application for a state distance education program. She had spent the entire afternoon searching for schools, choosing courses, and submitting the application without asking him a single question. He looked at her name on the paper, then at his niece. Her face was serious, but her eyes were sparkling. Not because she was about to cry, but because she was alive. I want to keep going, not just sit there waiting for each day to pass, Ellie said, her voice firm. I can't get my legs back, but I don't want to lose the rest of me. Thomas said nothing for a few seconds. Then he nodded slowly, firmly, as if signing an unspoken agreement. Good. Ellie looked at him, then chuckled. Aren't you surprised? No, it's your grandchild. The next few days, the house was filled with the clacking of keyboards, the teacher's voice over the loudspeaker, and Ellie's sighs every time she made a mistake. But she patiently tried again. Thomas supported her like a soldier supports a comrade, quietly, precisely, and never complaining. He adjusted the desk so that her wheelchair could reach it, raised the computer screen higher to ease her neck, and learned to use Zoom just to help her connect. When the internet was patchy, she still had nightmares sometimes. But she didn't scream anymore. When she woke up, she sat up, turned on the light, took a sip of water, and went back to bed. There were nights when Thomas would sit in the living room, pretending to be asleep with a gun ready next to him. But he knew that little by little Ellie was learning to keep herself from collapsing one foggy morning. Ellie pushed the cart out to the chicken coop Thomas was feeding them, shaking his hands as he did every day. Grandpa, yeah, I want to try cooking again. Thomas raised his head slowly. It's fine, there's no need to rush. I don't want to slow down anymore. She smiled, and the light in her eyes made him feel like he was 10 years ago, when Ellie was a little girl running out to the fields to call him home for cake. That smile had disappeared after the accident, but now it was back. Not perfect, but real. That night, the two of them had a simple dinner: corn porridge, some steamed vegetables, and buttered bread. Ellie did most of the cooking. Thomas just helped get the things up high and stood by just in case they didn't talk much during the meal. But the silence was no longer awkward. It was full, as if everything had fit together. After a violent collision, as Ellie cleared the table, Thomas watched his hand gently stroking the tablecloth as if tracing time. He thought of his wife, of the war of the comrades, who never returned, of the fear of growing old and powerless. But right now, here he was, no longer afraid because Ellie had chosen to live on. And that was enough for him to live on his own terms. Before going to bed, Ellie pushed the cart onto the porch. The night wind was gentle. The moon was faint behind the white clouds. She sat there, the blanket across her thighs, breathing quietly. Thomas went behind. He said nothing, just pulled the blanket up and sat down on the chair next to her. "Do you think everything will be okay?" she asked. "No, but I think we will be okay." She nodded. They both looked up at the sky. Not for anything, simply because it was time to look up. Life is not always gentle. Sometimes it drags people through cold and dark roads to test what remains, when all faith is worn away. But it is in those moments of near dissolution that love, no matter how old, quiet, or seemingly small, can still become the last refuge. Thomas is not a hero. He is just an old man, shaking hands, hunched back, living in the wilderness. But he stood up when he needed to, and Ellie, though confined to a wheelchair, found her own voice again, not with her legs, but with the courage of someone who refuses to give up. This story is not about glorious victory. It is about survival in silence, about the resilience of people who seem to have been forgotten by life, and how slowly and silently they still choose to continue loving, moving forward and standing guard for each other in the darkness. Thank you.